Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the county, Canaan and Associates and DPZ Co-Design, welcome to the first meeting of Series 3. My name is Marina Corey. I'm with DPZ, and I'm joined here by Matt Lambert, who will be delivering the presentation, and Mike White. From Canaan, we have Eliza Juliana with us, as well as many more from the county, including Alberto, Olin, and I see Commissioner Wilson too. So welcome, everyone. We will all be helping to answer your questions during the 2 Q&A pauses that we have. As a reminder, Series 1 was an introduction to the comprehensive plan and particularities of each of the 6 market areas. Series 2 was an introduction to sectors and place types intended to provide guidance on the degree of intensity for the future growth within each of the market areas in a more predictable manner. Series 3 is now about the zoning code, which supports the Vision 2050 comprehensive plan and actually provides the regulations for zoning controls to guide development and conservation. This first series is technical, but also interesting. We hope you'll agree. It highlights what our physical assessment of the county reveals, explains the difficulties with the current code, and introduces you to what is a form-based code and how the new code, which we are calling the Orange Code, is organized around a powerful tool called the Transect, which essentially defines the different character zones within the county. Series 3, different to the other 2, is divided into 3 sets of meetings. Tomorrow night is a repeat of tonight. So for those who don't catch all of it, feel free to join us again tomorrow. The second set is in early June, and it will describe in detail the different zoning categories and their massing form and generally their permitted uses. And the third set in early July will discuss all else that goes into zoning, all the interesting stuff, subdivisions, parking, signage, and such. So we look forward to your participation, your collaboration, and your engagement with us as we refine the new Orange Code, which you will see is the new regulatory tool that enables the objectives of your comprehensive plan that deal with issues of sustainability, affordability, a vibrant public realm, true housing choices, and increased walkability, to name a few. We are live streaming across many platforms and gathering questions in real time to answer at the end of the presentation and in the break as well. So please feel free to use the Q&A to put in some questions here, and also to write them in on Facebook and on YouTube. So now I'm going to turn it over to Alberto Vargas, the Planning Director for Orange County.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for your presence tonight. It is extremely valuable to us to continue to hear from those that are engaged in the process. As you know, and as Marina introduced, since last December to April of this year, we have been discussing the framework of the way Orange County Comp Plan is being reorganized into Vision 2050. And as also explained, today's conversation is really more about how that vision is intended to be implemented. We need to continue to engage you as the stakeholders, as the local residents of Orange County, to continue to inform us about the changes that are happening and how they're affecting you and your overall concerns that you may continue to have, so that we continue to address them, not only as part of the vision, but as part of the regulations as well. As you know, our current code is very old, over 57 years old, and it is a conventional zoning structure. It's based on land uses, and this conventional zoning has sections and subsections that are devoted to land uses such as residential, industrial, commercial. But Orange Code recognizes that the county is very diverse, not only in its topography, but also in the character of lifestyles, the development trends, and therefore it focuses more on the physical design of the built environment rather than the specific uses and the separations. And we'll hear quite a bit about that today and in the future meetings, where opportunities are provided to think about development really different than we have been thinking about it in the last 20, 30 years. We look at design solutions from a very different lens for the purpose of preserving or building great communities and neighborhoods that will be sustainable as we continue to grow in the future. So with that, I am going to recognize one more time Commissioner Nicole Wilson, who is with us tonight. There may be other commissioners that may be joining us, but just to give her an opportunity for any opening remarks. Commissioner, welcome, and thank you for your time tonight as well.
Thank you so much, Alberto. Can you hear me okay?
Very well.
Okay, here we are in 2021, but I'm still asking the 2020 question. Am I muted? Thank you so much again for the introduction, and I really want to welcome all the residents who are joining this evening, either for the first time or as part of the series. It's such an important part of the ongoing dialogue for the update to our comprehensive plan and to Orange Code. And I really believe that the community knows best what they need. So asking for the input is critical to empowering residents so that they can evaluate planning and code from their own lived experiences. So if you're a resident and you're tuning in, and if some of the things that we're talking about or that the experts here are talking about sound a little complex, you know what, hang in there, stay put. Continue the dialogue, call my office, email me. We will continue to talk about it because sometimes we really can break it down even further and get a better understanding of where you're coming from. I think it's critical that we continue to engage because what I hear from residents the most at my office is they're concerned about the changing character of where they live. So understanding that growth cannot be at the expense of our rivers, lakes, forests, and that we really need to codify and enforce, unpaved open spaces and passive recreation areas. So I look forward to seeing the ongoing conversation, and thank you so much again.
Thank you, Commissioner. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Matt Lambert, who's going to lead us through tonight's presentation. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Alberto. And well, luckily, on my first slide, Marina already covered this, so that's great. Although I will point out on the comment related to open space and passive recreation areas, those topics will be more central to the third set of meetings when we talk about site development. I will touch on it a little bit tonight, but just so you're aware, tonight we really provide a background and introduction to Orange Code, the why and what, covering very broad concepts. As mentioned, zoning can be very complex. Comprehensive plans can be very complex in the way they work together, and we're trying to break these things down into as digestible chunks as we can. But we understand that that a lot of these topics are new to people. So again, we'll look through this whole series. In the next pair of meetings, we'll look at the zoning districts that Orange Code is moving to. Specifically, which we're not going to get into today. Today we're talking about conceptual level issues, and then we'll get into site development, some division where we deal with open space. So to begin with, I just want to touch a couple points on Vision 2050 because this has been discussed in a number of previous meetings. In the first meeting series, Alberto gave a full overview of the comprehensive plan and the code. And in the second series of meetings, I introduced the concepts of sectors and place types, which are part of the comprehensive plan. Those connect directly to Orange Code. So Vision 2050, as a reminder, is an update of the overall comprehensive plan. And this is a document that sets countywide policies in many different situations, including, of course, growth and housing, as we'll talk about today, as well as infrastructure investments, economic development, and many other issues of countywide importance. In response to rapidly changing times, significant growth pressure, and an overall sentiment that growth over the past few decades has in many cases been detrimental to the character and function of the county, the comprehensive plan is undergoing a major change. A key change we'll discuss today is being proactive in controlling where future growth will occur and the form that it takes. A couple of survey results that Alberto shared before will be helpful for today's subject matter. This first survey we'll look at the results of indicates that few people really know or understand the comprehensive plan or the land development code, the zoning code, and that most people feel that new development is out of character with their neighborhood. And that really sets a strong basis for the direction of the comprehensive plan changes and the reason that we're discussing the specific concept level changes for Orange Code today. There's another survey that suggests strong goals of preserving rural lands, agricultural lands, and preserving existing neighborhoods, and to grow through filling in underdeveloped places in a manner that allows people to get around without a car should they choose to do so. And last, this survey was interesting as it indicated a preference for proximity of living, working, shopping, and recreation, along with the prior sentiments that were discussed. I just wanted to point to these. You may have heard them before, but they really do set a strong basis for the zoning code modifications. This is a slide from the last series. I just have a couple of these to give you that background. And it's upon these sentiments that we make these changes. The elements of sectors and place types which we presented in the last series are linked directly to Orange Code. And they work together to provide a vision for what places should become. And in Vision 2050, that's really about how growth and development can contribute to that vision through Orange Code. Just a note, you can get on the Vision 2050 website all the prior series of presentations. So once you get through these Orange Code series, you may want to go back to sectors and place types so you can really kind of connect those concepts. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with land development code or a zoning code, they're basically the same thing. It's a collection of regulations that control development on individual properties. This controls how large buildings can be, where they can be placed on a property, how much of that property can be covered in buildings and pavement, and the uses that are allowed within buildings and on properties, as well as the details related to those uses, like how much parking is required. As I discussed in the last set of presentations, Series 2, sectors are in the comprehensive plan, and they determine where and to what extent growth should occur. These are the sectors which cover very large areas of the county. And as sectors direct growth, the majority of all new growth is encouraged in targeted and intended sectors. And those are mostly on corridors that are highly trafficked and commercial, or intended are places that have already been approved. There's a different sector called the established sector, and that covers most of the existing neighborhoods. And while that area may see some growth as has naturally been occurring within the neighborhood over time, it's essentially unchanged in the neighborhood by Orange Code. Orange Code is not proposing major changes within those neighborhoods. But the targeted areas, which will see more rapid change, will be closely controlled by Orange Code to ensure a consistent and predictable outcome, a transition of height and use as development occurs near neighborhoods, and increasing opportunities for walking, rolling, and biking. Place types are the other thing that we talked about last time. These are more specific than sectors. These cover areas the size of, say, a neighborhood or the four corners of a major intersection that typically is made up of a collection of shopping centers. Place types direct the future character of these smaller areas across the county and are generally directed in terms of intensity according to the sectors. Whether a place should seriously intensify or not intensify much at all is in part directed by sectors in terms of the amount of change, and then by place types to determine the form that place should take in the future. Orange Code takes it from that point to the building. Place types are organized into 4 categories. There's urban types, which are applicable in the urban surface area, and rural types outside of it. Open space types that cover natural areas and large parks, and special place types that cover areas in need of special rules like industrial districts and universities. And these two fit together like this within an overall goal to intensify and grow in the targeted sector, mostly through redeveloping commercial properties along major roads. And this scale here, at this scale, the details are a little fuzzy, and you may have seen that in the last presentations. Orange Code now carrying that forward is the document that implements sectors and place types on the ground by regulating how much and in what form development can occur on individual properties. We'll get into some code concepts soon, but first we wanted to cover a little bit of additional background. To begin the Orange Code rewrite process, we first took a detailed look around Orange County. There are many positive attributes and a long history. The area is growing for a lot of these reasons, including a great and diversifying economy and global tourist industry. These are situated among a strong rural and agricultural heritage and a unique natural environment that offers plenty of opportunities for recreation as well as conservation. Because the county has grown consistently for quite some time, there are many models of successful traditional towns and new town development upon which to model future growth. And that growth is increasingly being serviced by diversifying transit options. But there are also a number of issues, of course. Decreasing affordability of housing is a big one. That's reflected in the lack of housing diversity through much of the county. And the pattern of past growth has also resulted in a loss of rural heritage while delivering places that are only accessible by the car. And once you're in a car, the post-1950s development pattern really results in a lot of traffic, and nobody appreciates that. This is especially true as employment areas are heavily concentrated, and that contributes to serious traffic burdens during morning and evening rush hours due to an imbalance between the location of jobs and where people live and how they have to travel from where they live to where they work. To respond to the traffic volumes, collector and arterial roads are large and traffic moves fast. And that's really not comfortable for properties along them. And as we'll talk about shortly, there are many developments that have written their own standards, planned developments, because they feel existing codes are a mismatch with the market demand. These are examples of some of the mapping completed as part of the assessment. Alberto really discussed much of this background in the first series of town hall meetings. And so again, you can see that on the Vision 2050 website. Today, they're just here for reference. And along with this sort of county-wide mapping, studies were also completed to compare the character and detail of different areas within the county. This collection represents a portion of that work. There's quite a lot of this. Here we looked at street types and how often there are connections, the extent of sidewalks and bicycle lanes, if there are clearly blocks, like an area that roughly has 4 streets around it at the edges, these sort of blocks of development as in traditional growth. And at what scale are the blocks? Are they so large that most people would choose to drive rather than walk, for instance? We looked at building types and the distribution of building types, houses that are large or small, duplexes, townhomes, and so forth. And lastly, at the types of neighborhoods and centers that make up different areas of the county. So overall, the physical assessment was aimed at describing Orange County from both a broad overall view and uncovering patterns of natural systems, commuting, housing diversity, and cost, and then at a closer view to identify differences in character, which are significant across the country. Logically, we must ask, why does the current code need to be rewritten? This infographic actually points out some of the very most important issues. The current code has about 1,200 pages of content. That's a ton of information to absorb. So far with Orange Code, we're coordinating with the comprehensive plan and still going through detailed finalization with Public Works and planning. But so far we're at about 300 pages in comparison to 1,200 pages. And I'll tell you, it's complex enough at 300 pages. So within that 1,200 pages are 20 different zones for residential. And because it's so long and has been patched for years, there are 7 definitions of building. While they may be similar, they can often lead to confusion. Do you need 11 different definitions of a person? The lack of coordination is not only about definitions, but also about important regulatory details that may contradict each other. It's left up to the applicant, staff, and ultimately the commissioners and the Board of Appeals to determine which requirements are applicable, which can be a long and costly process all around. There are also 145 exceptions to rules that are in the code applying to a specific use, like you must do this except in these circumstances. And finally, 20% of unincorporated Orange County is within planned development districts. These are places that have written their own rules because the current code does not allow for places like Horizon West. And while that type of development is desirable, it's difficult to permit once its planned development district is passed. It is difficult to administer for county staff who have to manage a significant number of overlapping rules. That was a lot of information, really. So I'll try not to be too complex, but we can boil it down really to 3 things. The current code is complicated, it's full of inconsistencies, and it doesn't allow for development in the form that is desired, and therefore it's outdated. And all of those things contribute to new development being more expensive than it should be and not being in the character that residents expect development to follow. In our initial evaluation, we found the current code to be pretty poor in doing its job. Clarity is a big problem. Even internally, we understand that new staff requires about 1.5 years to become familiar with the current code. And that's their job. Imagine residents trying to understand zoning. Organization is very poor, including the inconsistencies already mentioned. The process, while higher than others, is also poor. Permits take a long time and can be complicated and costly. And because the code doesn't allow the sort of desired market outcomes, most permits include waivers, and those are conditions where a code requirement is officially ignored. Residents complain that new development doesn't fit the character of existing places, so the built result is poor. And it's not even good for the developers on the other side who have to pursue costly workarounds and waivers. That takes time and money. And finally, the current code does not coordinate land use and transportation, and instead encourages growth in undeveloped areas, which fails really from a sustainability standpoint. So current code, it's time to go. And one of the reasons that the current code is a problem is that it's overly focused on use. On the left are all the uses. On the right, we'll talk about this in a bit, but sort of the way that you can manage standards. Actually, these are the zones, the complexity of zone, but it's the same thing with the use. And we'll talk really about this in a bit, but it's not really focused on issues that affect compatibility from one property to another. Similarly, the code is focused on individual properties and not collective outcomes of development in a larger area. The result of this is a lot of inconsistency. What is built on one property has very little relation to what is built on neighboring or nearby properties. This does not create places that can be named, found, and loved. Instead, it perpetuates placelessness, where we spend more time in the car than with our families and friends. With place types in the comprehensive plan, zones in Orange Code will be better assigned to create main streets, urban centers, and downtowns, along with new neighborhoods. Here's Lake Nona's downtown, for instance, and here they mix shops, offices, and housing. And because they're all connected and located along the sidewalk, they create a place that works for cars, pedestrians, cyclists. And because the form of the buildings is fairly similar, they are compatible with each other. Of course, this would not be compatible with single-story housing, and the code doesn't intend to add this type of development within neighborhoods. But later we'll talk about how the code really manages compatibility. But the existing code does not, and developments like this are built independently from the code by their own rules. But a new code approach is not necessarily new. Thornton Park really demonstrates many of the characteristics that new development is interested in producing. Here at a smaller scale, as would be appropriate in many areas of the county that abut neighborhoods. Today, this would be impossible to recreate without breaking rules. And finally, there's an issue of coordinating zoning and subdivision requirements to align with Vision 2050. Subdivision rules direct the layout of streets, open space, and conservation areas. These standards are very old and direct development in a form that is no longer desirable. And in fact, we heard from staff across all sorts of departments that the requirements need to change. As I briefly discussed creating places, subdivision and zoning today are both focused too much on individual properties instead of acknowledging the larger area. As a result, the collection of individual developments don't add up to create full neighborhoods. They're mostly just clusters of housing that then require you to drive for anything you want outside of the home. The quality of open space also suffers as a result of the current code. Open space is required at a few different levels in zoning and in subdivision, and additionally indirectly required in order to handle stormwater. But these requirements don't ensure that open space is usable to residents, just that it's provided. Today and for decades, open space has been an afterthought, dribbled around the outside of developments. Over time, developers have found, though, that people want open spaces that improve their quality of life, like on the right, where children can play and neighbors can meet. So all new sizable developments have proceeded through a planned development process. So they could achieve this because the codes don't really allow these types of places where people want to invest their money and raise their family. And lastly, I wanted to point out that both the development community and people who are purchasing homes have long signaled that existing codes are out of date. As a result, many new developments are built using their own rules, as we've talked about. And that results in many different standards across the country. And that's difficult for staff, for development, for the developers, and it's even difficult for residents to interpret which rules are applicable to properties nearby them. And because they're out of date, the process to permit the type of development that has become desirable now makes that type of development more expensive than it needs to be. Here's the map of those areas, about 470 planned developments. And notice that most are at the edges of already built areas. This map essentially shows that all new growth, as growth sort of has gone outward for a long time, that all new growth is opting out of the current code. And with each of those subject to their own new standards, there's just a serious lack of coordination. So right now, the future is being dictated one development at a time. And Vision 2050 wants to direct the future very clearly with a clear vision that everyone can understand. So clearly the zoning code needs an overhaul. Orange Code, which is that needed overhaul, fundamentally reworks zoning and subdivision in order to increase predictability, meaning it's easier to understand what new development will look like, and to increase compatibility, meaning that new development is of a similar character to neighboring places and provides a meaningful transition if it is much different. It is also focused on making places among multiple properties and developments rather than isolated projects one at a time. As Vision 2050 is focused on infill development of existing commercial corridors and adding more diverse and affordable types of housing, the new Orange Code is designed to implement that vision. As I've discussed, it's aimed at being easier to comprehend for residents, the development community, and county leadership and staff. With a strong future vision within Vision 2050, Orange Code's able to be more streamlined and clear, directing development towards that future vision. So I'm going to actually pause now before we get into some of the details, just to see if you had any upfront questions, though some of those questions may be answered as we get through the next section.
Thank you, Matt. I have a question for Alberto, and Alberto, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but before we begin, but I think Matt's last two slides struck a chord with me, showing the amount of development that's done through PDs, as we all know, and we know that it has caused issues. However, I've also seen PDs in Orange County that are, 50 pages long with lots of detailed regulations attached to them. And the reality is that some of those detailed regulations are addressing issues that are not addressed in the zoning code. They get to level of specificity and in many times attach form standards to them. So I wanted to make a comment and then ask a question. So I would say that they recognize a lot of the elements that were missing in the code and have found their way now into the new code. That's probably the positive attributes of PDs. So, well, all this to say, I started thinking, do PDs help or hurt? We know that they are absolutely awful from an administrative standpoint because some are very well written and some are very poorly written, and there's no consistent standards amongst them. We think we've figured out a way to require the minimum level of impact or regulations required in Orange Code. But if you had to say PDs hurt or help, what would you say?
So that's a very good question, Marina. So I'm just going to go ahead and make a very specific distinction, because as most of staff present in today's town hall knows, the PD process is pretty much negotiated with one exception. And the exception is for those intended, as we continue to get ourselves used to the nomenclature of intended sectors, including Horizon West, for those communities that have already a vision associated to them, and quite a bit of history of development, they begin to perform with the requirement of a PD, but it's directly linked to that particular community and the regulations that implement the series of neighborhoods and communities within Horizon West and other intended communities that have already been adopted. Innovation Way, including Sunbridge, and other communities that are in the making right now. So setting that aside, I believe that your question directly relates to the fact of the surprise element associated to a PD. They are unpredictable to a certain degree because it is a process that is negotiated, if you would, when the developer, the consultants submit a specific application to Orange County. We begin to unveil and better understand the intended development program. We maximize not only the types of uses that are associated to that development program, but also the densities and intensities associated to that development program. And then they wave away from the existing current code, which would require their implementation of that particular development program a certain way that is inconsistent to the intended development of that community that's in front of us. So there is a very high level of uncertainty that happens not only through the review process, but also much more important in terms of how it affects the surrounding neighborhoods and the surrounding communities of that particular, where that particular PD is being reviewed at. So there is no anticipated vision other than existing future land uses in our future land use map, in which the reason why we have a PD is that is a comp plan amendment to that future land use, and it's turning itself into a PD. So it's very unpredictable. I think it hurts at that level of unpredictability in terms of how Orange County is growing and has been growing for all this time. And I believe Vision 2050 will begin to address a much more accurate, focused vision as to where growth will happen in the county. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, yes, it does. Alberto, thank you. I think the level of uncertainty and unpredictability really underpins this entire effort. I see that Commissioner Wilson has her hand up. So I wanted to.
I
do have a comment on that topic, but I'll give Commissioner Wilson the
Sorry,
floor
it's actually
first.
it was such a quick follow-up question to Marina's question, and in Alberto, just to kind of clarify further, when you talk about intended growth outside of those areas, who is intending, or what was the intent? That word is kind of amorphous for me, so I just wanted to identify what that intent is, because a lot of times residents move to an area where something was zoned rural or agricultural, so it's not their intent, and the urban boundary is still very clear when they go to look up where that is, so that doesn't look like that intent. So in order to kind of understand and explain it, if we could clarify what that means. Thank you so much.
Sure, Commissioner. Let me go ahead and just address it from Vision 2050's perspective. As you know, we have started to put together the vision map. And the vision map is composed of all the sectors that are part of that vision map. One specific sector that we collectively recognize that needs to be identified, incorporated in the vision, but really set aside from trying to move away from all of the entire process of entitlements that those communities went through at a certain period of time. In the example of Horizon West, the first sector plan in the state of Florida, all the planning effort and exercise that has gone to make it part of what it is today, and it continues to implement that particular vision as not only identified in the existing 2010-2030 comprehensive plan policies, goals and objectives, but also the codes that govern each one of those villages as we are familiar with them. So what we decided to do, just as the example of Horizon West, other communities that have gone through that level of entitlement process and exercise, including Avalon Park, for example. I mentioned Innovation Way with Sunbridge and Camino Real. Lake Pickett is another one. this particular review process and adoption process of the policies and the comprehensive plan took years and years. And the code that is, because we were short of an updated code at the time of that process, each one of those communities carry their own code that implements the specific vision of the community. So we decided to call those sectors intended for that purpose. So we recognize them, we're putting them aside, and Vision 2050 integrates them in the overall vision of how we're growing for the next 30 years, but we're not modifying, changing the policy or creating new regulations for those particular communities.
So
Thank you.
Marina,
Yeah.
I do see where you said good or bad is an interesting question, because there's also along with the bad and there's a good and bad of revealing issues with the way things may have been done in one place or another, and especially adjacencies. But also on the good side, they've sort of signaled that the market doesn't want what the code has to offer. And a lot of times when we go into code rewrites, that question turns around saying, well, does the market really want this? And I think they've made that clear.
But I think it even goes a step beyond that, Matt. It's, yes, the market doesn't want it, but also the existing code isn't ready. It doesn't have the tools necessary to meet what the market needs. But there are some PDs that try to just skirt around the issues and go to the most baseline set of regulations. Like some PDs aren't good enough, right? So they're also not providing what the market wants, but they're finding ways around the code, which doesn't serve anyone well.
That is
Okay.
correct. And Marina, before we keep going,
Yeah.
I would like to recognize Commissioner Moore, who joined us. She was not here at the introduction, but she's here with us today, or tonight. And Commissioner, welcome, and thank you for your time tonight as well.
Thank you. It's great that we have many commissioners on this very important topic. We always like to say that the code is the most obvious tool in which to change the way you develop in the most comprehensive manner possible. So we really value your participation and your attendance, because it is a tricky thing to know and understand, but it does. We think it'll be very helpful for you down the line. I had another question for Matt, but let me just let me talk a little bit about these questions first that people are posing, and then I'll go back to the question a question I have for Matt. I'm actually going to direct the next one to Eliza, which has to do with Pine Hills. There's two questions on Pine Hill. I'm going to combine them, Eliza, and maybe direct them to you. Is the Pine Hill community considered an established sector? And can the county see the needs of Pine Hill, that the Pine Hill needs a look through a tighter lens of development and obviously through zoning? So could you want to address that a little bit?
Sure. So Pine Hills is a fairly large area, and on our current maps, it's a mix of established and intended sector. So that means that portions of it would be intended to essentially maintain their existing character, and portions of it would be planned for redevelopment, which is consistent with plans that have been in the works for a long time for Pine Hills, as well as what we've heard over time from the community in terms of wanting to see redevelopment. And I think that's the thrust of one of these questions here, is there's a desire among certainly certain folks within the Pine Hills area to see some positive new development coming in, and absolutely the designation of an intended sector, as well as the application of the code that would follow on that, would encourage positive new development within Pine Hills. In addition, there's going to be some particular attention to this area as part of an upcoming design and coding charrette that we're doing as part of the coding process, that's going to specifically look at a portion of the Pine Hills area, particularly Pine Hills and Silver Star.
Great, thank you. Alberto touched on this, you touched on this, the idea that some of the legacy of development in Orange County is obviously being carried forth, because these are projects that have development permits and that are under construction, and those will move forward under the standards of the old code. But anything that doesn't have a development permit will be permitted under the new code. One one thing I wanted Matt to talk about just very briefly, because I'm sure it'll be addressed in series in the meetings 3 and 4. But because you touch, Matt, on the physical assessment we did of the county and talked about the positive and negative attributes. One thing we didn't talk about was the deep dive we did into the existing code standards, because we aren't coding a greenfield site, right? So people have vested rights, people have development rights, and we really did spend time sort of trying to document your DNA. What can we extract from what's permitted, and how do we reshape that in a better manner? So Matt, are you talking about synoptic surveys in this one, or in the next one, or in the next series?
Yeah, that'll be in the next series. Today, we'll be getting into form-based codes in general,
Yeah.
urban development ordinances, and how the Transect helps us produce compatible places.
Okay.
And we'll get into the specific zones in the next one, which is how we did go through all the existing standards and sort of evolve them and reorganize them, but not change them in a significant way from the standpoint of existing residential uses. Now, when you get to commercial zones and office zones and so forth, those have had much more substantial change.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point that was part of the assessment as well, of course. Okay, so a couple of questions from Zoom. Transportation by cars is a mess and getting worse. What are the future plans? I think I'll let Matt address that, but we did cover that in series 2.
Yeah, and I know I'll mention it a couple times when we go through the second half of this presentation, but there are a few pieces of this. I did mention the fact that that there's a concentration of jobs in certain areas, and housing is not near the areas where jobs are located, and so that has a big influence on it. There's also a lot of land that has been developed in a manner with roads that are disconnected and larger lots, so you have to drive further to get to places, which means that there's just more people on the road. They sort of concentrate in this fashion. The way old codes were written was to sort of think of cars like a tree, and you're trying to get everybody from the branches to a central arterial, and what that does is it creates a lot of traffic. And we've learned over the years that networks of streets function much better. Networks of streets that don't only require a car also give you different options, but it's not only that, it's this transportation plus land use connection, where you also need the use of land, which means, do you have housing? At what intensity? Are there services that you need on a daily basis nearby? Are there potentially jobs nearby? And when you start to distribute those more evenly in places across the county, then you have the opportunity to sort of change what the patterns are. That doesn't mean that if the, say, shopping center at the major intersection near your house is redeveloped to be something that's more like a mixed use walkable place, which is sort of the intention in the vision plan. That doesn't mean that you would find a job there necessarily, but some people would, and they wouldn't be on that same commuting route that you would be on. And then the last piece of it is being efficient with public transportation. And a pattern of relatively low intensity single family development is really incompatible with public transportation. And so much of the goal of looking at these major intersections for mixed use centers and these corridors for more housing is really in support of making public transportation function optimally, and eventually therefore also get enough funding to upgrade, and all these sorts of things that we want to see out of transportation. We can't really achieve that with a pattern of development that isn't supportive of transportation.
Great, thank you. There's one very good question here that someone asked, which I can answer in one word, which I like, which is, will all properties in the county be rezoned when Orange Code is adopted, or will we property owners be required to rezone ourselves? I like what the new code offers, but I don't think I should be made to apply for rezoning. So that's a very good question, and the reality is, yes, there will be a direct translation of what the old zoning code was and what the new code is now going to be that's applied on your property, and you will not be required to seek a rezoning. That's not to say that if someone doesn't want to rezone their property, if they are in the right sector, that they can't then follow the same process that a rezoning would require. We'll hopefully streamlined a little bit through this new code, but you won't have to rezone. It's a little more than one word. Yes was the answer I was going for. Alberto, this is a question for you. How is the new code incorporating the Right to Clean Water Charter Amendment?
So we have quite a bit of an analysis going on right now in terms of from EPD as well as utilities, the analysis of how we are growing in Orange County, existing impacts that we have in terms of the relationship to growth, and how we're going to create much more specific policies and strategies to preserve the quality of water and the quantity of water that's needed for the county's growth. So we have a pending conversation right now and coordination with those two specific divisions, and we're headed in front of the Board of County Commissioners with those challenges that we recognize. Those are challenges. Water, in terms of how it directly ties to the growth patterns that we have, is going to be identified as an opportunity and challenges of growth, and that's happening in June 1st at the BCC special workshop that's been scheduled between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. in the afternoon.
Okay.
No, Marina, there was a question also from Commissioner Moore in the chat, which is, can we give a more detailed description of an inhospitable collector road and possible remedies to make them more hospitable? And what we mean by a roadway being inhospitable for the uses along the edges of it is that you may notice the larger the road is, the further buildings end up being set back from them, and the less you see people walking or biking using any mode that's not a car. And those environments are also not very good for public transportation. When cars move very, very fast, that is directly incompatible with the speed that pedestrians move and bicycles move. The sort of change in thinking from a transportation standpoint is to consider the speed that different roadways users move at a different point in time to consider how to compatibly build a roadway. But when you have a lot of fast moving traffic, it also doesn't work to have buildings close to the street. And when you don't have buildings close to the street, it's not comfortable for pedestrians. And you set further back, the signs get larger, and it sort of creates this environment that is common across the US. And I'll show some slides on that in a moment. But what can you do about it? Well, the best news is that the Florida Department of Transportation has really been taking context seriously, and they've modified their standards. They're in the process of continuing to modify their standards for the larger roadways to become more viable for uses along their edges that are sort of closer to the street. And those uses also use land more efficiently. There's great opportunities for infill to absorb growth in existing areas and not growing outside, and to support transportation, biking, and walking. But you can't do that along a street that is really just focused on moving vehicles. But of course, part of that is dealing with the issues that we talked about before, about a network of streets and having patterns that are not just sort of the AM commute and PM commute patterns to help distribute traffic, so that both the roadway can respond more sympathetically to uses on its edges, like you see in downtowns and main streets and so forth, but also not to overload it unnecessarily with traffic.
Thank you, Matt. I think I'm going to ask one more question so that we give enough time for the second session, and then whatever we don't answer here, we will answer at the end of the presentation. But this one is also an interesting one. I'm going to direct it to Alberto. But it says, any code is worthless if it's not enforced, like in Wedgefield. You need more experienced and educated code enforcers. And the follow-up question related to that is, street lighting is very poor on Silver Star Road. Within the last year, there have been 2 accidents involving pedestrians versus cars. What will be done about that? Well, the street lighting could be Matt, because it has to do with different, you need pedestrian scaled lighting and vehicular scaled lighting. But do you want to talk a little bit about code enforcement, Alberto?
Sure. 100% in agreement regarding when codes are not enforced, communities suffer from it. Again, knowing what the rules are, not only for the existing character, the preservation of existing character of the neighborhood environment is vital. It's very important for those residents within the neighborhood itself. So we are, and I think the department itself of that is within the neighborhoods, as well as code enforcement, is in the process of restructuring itself to create a lot more engagement and awareness of not necessarily the stick side of enforcement, but also the carrot side, which is about education and about making sure that the rules are followed. A much more humanized way to understand the rules of a successful community. And I think that's the direction that code enforcement, together with neighborhoods, is beginning to address right now as they continue to implement those the specific rules of maintenance and maintaining the character of those neighborhoods. Regarding new codes and how codes need to be followed, I think the statement that's being made tonight with a new set of rules and regulations for new development and the preservation of existing is fundamental to being able to respond to the question. Whenever we don't have codes that are expected within that specific neighborhood and they deviate from it, we ask for waivers. They generate surprises, as we discussed before. And I think Orange Code will continue to address very specific elements of predictability, and with very important elements of flexibility as well. But the flexibility aspect of Orange Code are not going to be unexpected. They should be embedded in a range of factors within modifications of the regulations within Orange Code. So yeah, I'm hoping that addresses the question itself.
I'd like to say one thing, because I know Matt's going to talk more about this, that relates both to code enforcement and street lighting. To make a distinction, you just said it, Alberto, between complexity and complicated. So your existing code was complicated, and it probably made it code enforcement more difficult as a result, because there's just that many more rules to have to track. And as Matt said, 1,200 pages to 300 pages is simplifying the code and boiling it down to really what is essential. So hopefully, just by that alone, will make enforcement more easy, because we're being very targeted and writing rules that are actually easier to interpret. Even for us, people who write codes a lot, sometimes the way your code is written takes us 6-7 times to really try and understand what it's trying to say. So that part of it will be easier, we hope. With respect to the complex and the street lighting, I think as Matt begins to describe the transect, you will see that it is Orange County is complicated. It's a different living environment, and as a result, it's not one solution or even two solutions for areas, but different solutions for different areas. So street lighting should be different on streets that is intended to principally prioritize cars, and some streets that are more walkable and or bikeable would have different street lighting that is intended to also support the pedestrian and bike infrastructure. That's part of the pedestrian bike infrastructure that has a place as well.
Yeah.
So that may
And-
be a good transition to you, Matt, to begin to talk about what a form-based code is and how it differs from a
Yes, which I have to move
conventional.
through, and I won't sidestep the Silver Star question because I can't comment on what the capital improvement plan is going forward for addressing changes on that roadway, but I do know that the standards are in the process of changing, and we'll get to that here in this part of the discussion.
All yours. Thank you.
So diving in, now we're going to look at how Orange Code differs from the current zoning code and subdivision standards. Not getting into specifics in this meeting, as we've said, there's more meetings planned to dive in. Right now, it's really about the topmost organizational points about how Orange Code works and why it's written that way. So the first why that drives everything else is predictability. Unlike the existing comprehensive plan, Vision 2050 directs future growth in specific places and formats. Using place type structure described earlier, Orange Code can pick up from where the comprehensive plan leaves off, ensuring that zoning regulations produce built outcomes that match the expectations of the residents. In order to best achieve predictability, a different set of tools is necessary, yet in the end will be easier to comprehend. And if neighbors, owners, and developers all know what to expect, outcome of development's really not a mystery. So current zoning has little concern with the form of buildings, rather the use and density or even the amount of commercial building area that are allowed is the primary way that development is regulated. There's some elements of form like setbacks and building height that are regulated, but they're an afterthought. And a setback being how far a building has to be pushed back into the site from a road or a property line. A form-based code, however, begins with the form of the building first, ensuring that building setbacks and heights are similar. Are the buildings close to the street? How close? Are they of a similar scale? And also that there are frequent entries along the sidewalk. It really pays attention to the experience of being a person on the street. Use and density are considered secondary, as the use within these buildings can vary greatly along with the densities in the buildings. And we'll talk about that. That may seem a little crazy, so let's look at the elements. So here was that use table, and actually, I think I'll fix this for tomorrow. I thought this was a use table. This is the standards table, but the use table, let me tell you, it's on the next slide. You'll see in a second. So a form-based code is distinguished as not really being a use-based code. And one of the first issues we address from a form-based code is to simplify uses. And we'll talk more about this even in the next meeting. Here, and I'll show you on the next slide, just imagine for the next moment. On the left are the specific uses addressed in the current code, on the right, simplification in the Orange Code. And it's not simply important to distinguish between, it's just simply not important if a salon has 6 seats or 16 seats, but a lot of use-based codes dive into that much minutia. And that minutia of different uses does not help determine if a use will be compatible with its surroundings. And when it comes down to it, what a code is supposed to do is supposed to ensure compatibility between neighboring properties. So here's the uses. This was the right one to put in, but you can see it's gigantic, right? So the actual consolidation of uses looks more like this. But what does consolidation of uses really mean? Let's just look at an example of coffee shops. Here's a coffee shop, many people are familiar with. Note that it's a single-story building by itself with parking surrounding it and a drive-through. Not all coffee shops share these characteristics, but the form of the building and the form of the parking are important. If you built this in downtown Orlando, that wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. So here's a coffee shop in a different context, a historic home converted to a business. This building also wouldn't make a lot of sense downtown, or even where the last coffee shop is located, but it fits pretty well in a small scale neighborhood center, along with a few other small businesses. This type of neighborhood business is certainly more appropriate near low scale homes than a downtown building would be, or even the prior drive-through. Here's yet a little blurry, but yet a different coffee shop along a newly constructed Main Street. This one's particularly interesting from the vantage point of a use-based code. You know, in the use-based code, perhaps nobody ever considered cats and a coffee shop being combined, right? And so as a result, the permitting of this business, I'm sure, was difficult, time-consuming, and probably more expensive than it needed to be. But in any case, this cafe is distinguished from the prior mainly because it's in a two-story building next to other businesses built along a retail street with seating on the sidewalk. So here's that cafe in context. And this is how form in general in context is more critical than use. Each of those buildings, the businesses may be different. They may be a different use, yet they work together because they share a form. Here's a coffee shop in a building downtown. It's more important that this business is in a tall building downtown than the fact that it's a coffee shop. You can run a coffee shop in all sorts of buildings and contexts, but you could not take this downtown building and locate it in place of any of the other cafes we've seen, and particularly that one in a converted house. That would be incompatible. And you know, while we're looking at it, this is also a coffee shop. So use is really not a good predictor of compatibility. And as a result, form-based codes deprioritize use. In a form-based code, the height of a building, the amount of activity within it is controlled first, and the particulars of use are addressed secondarily. So simplifying uses significantly reduces the burden on businesses and building owners that the specific use in a tenant space, you know, that use may change over time. You know, one year it's a salon, maybe the salon fails, or maybe they're so successful that they move to a better address and a cafe comes in, or an office. You know, when you have a use-based code, those changes can be quite complicated, but it's really common along main streets and in neighborhood centers and downtowns for uses to change over time. And certainly it's not just about coffee. Here's two different 7-Elevens a few blocks from each other, both in a downtown context. And the one on the left, though, is really in conflict with the surrounding buildings, while the one on the right is compatible with the buildings that surround it. And since use is not a good predictor of the form of buildings, let's look at some other ways current codes regulate development. There's this term, this is in comprehensive plans, this is in zoning codes. It's floor area ratio, and it's often used to regulate development. It's a tool that restricts the total square footage in a building according to the size of the property. So all these images, all these examples represent a property of 1/2 acre with buildings of different sizes and heights. But all these conditions have the same floor area ratio, and they would result in a vastly different character. While the floor area ratio may be required as a control, as sometimes it is in comprehensive plans, it's really not a good predictor of the character of development. It really shouldn't be a primary means of ensuring compatibility. Surprisingly to many, density is also a poor predictor of the character of development. For all the grief that people give over density, it's really rarely understood well. So these all represent the same overall site area, and they are all the same density. But you can also see that they occupy the site quite differently. The top left shows 4 houses, each at 3,000 square feet. They occupy a lot more of the property than the bottom left, which is, or the bottom right, which is a multifamily building with 4 units. On the bottom left, there's 2 duplex homes, and the top right is 4 smaller cottages. So these are all the same density, but a very vastly different outcome, and even occupation of the property with impervious surface. So too often people get hung up on density as a number, yet density really isn't a good predictor of the character of development. So let's look at these 4 pictures. Sure, the difference between a single family house and the large apartment building is obvious, but where do the other examples compare? So these images represent examples of density at 74 units to the acre, 44 units per acre, 25 units per acre, and 14 units per acre. Which one's which? Well, here's how they align. You wouldn't guess that the lower right or the lower left, you wouldn't guess that the lower left example is the most dense. Similarly, you'd really probably guess that the large single family house would be less than 14 units per acre. And I would guess that the big apartment building would be more than 44 units per acre. But there are really other elements that affect density. In particular, the size of the property, the amount of land that's dedicated to parking and open space, and that there's other options for gentle ways of adding density, like in the bottom right, the accessory dwelling unit with the home. That adds density to the property. But the point is that density doesn't predict character, and also that higher densities can be provided within a character that seems to be lower in density if the form of the buildings and parking management are well designed, like the bottom left. And you may be wondering about that 74 units per acre number. Well, I checked it, I double checked it, it's accurate. The building occupies half a block in Alexandria, Virginia, and it appears to be a series of buildings, but it's really one multifamily building at 74 units per acre. So having better context around density is important as we discuss making housing more affordable. The primary way to make housing more affordable is to make housing smaller and to provide more dwelling units within the same building size. This is a helpful chart, I think, that shows the trends in apartment size and rent over the past decade. Of course, the price has been going up, just like all housing prices have been going up. But the key here is that the size is trending down. The size of units of apartments is trending down. And so this has a major implication on density restrictions. And this is a critical issue for Orange County. If you want to stop growth in rural and agricultural areas, and you want to preserve existing neighborhoods, then the places where growth is to be directed, the targeted sector principally, those need to allow density numbers higher than what you may think is reasonable. And look, most people simply don't understand a density number, they just think that low is good. But when we look to use land efficiently to reduce the loss of agricultural lands and to make public transportation, walking and biking viable, then you must have higher densities where that growth is accommodated. Here's two examples in my neighborhood, historic buildings that have always been on the right 2 units, and on the left 4 dwelling units, right next to single family homes. On the left, 32 units per acre. It really doesn't feel that dense on the street, particularly as apartments and condos get smaller, and also single family homes are in trends in 2 directions. They're getting larger and smaller at the same time. But even that duplex on the right is 17 units per acre. So consider this diagram from a previous slide. These 2 quarter-acre properties could easily range from a density of 4 units per acre to 16 units per acre without changing the overall form of the building. The same amount of yard space, the same setback distance from streets and side property lines, the same height. The only real difference would be a few more cars to park. However, larger homes have more cars per dwelling than smaller apartments. And it can also be a problem if it's located, if you put the parking in front of the building, but that issue is really easily solved if we consider the form of a building and site issues, which Orange County does to ensure that the parking is located in a way that it doesn't negatively impact neighbors. But our goal is not to change existing neighborhoods in any substantial way. Instead, we're looking at infill corridors, shopping centers, and other properties that are not principally single-family neighborhoods. So take this example of new townhomes in downtown. These townhomes, still single-family, these are 44 units per acre. That sure sounds high, but the building form is well controlled, and the parking and access to parking is well regulated and located. So the result is a type of housing that can be a good transition at the edge between existing single-family homes and higher intensity development along major corridors. 44 units per acre, as in here, doesn't have to be scary. And in fact, this density can absorb a lot of new housing growth without eating up agricultural land, and can result in more efficient public transportation if it's located near the corridors, which is where Vision 2050 plans and Orange Code looks to implement. Now, using the form of a building is a better tool to control development and to ensure compatibility. So we'll have some of these higher intensity examples because at the lower intensity scale, there's not as much of a difference in the way that you control development. It's still better to control form, but at the higher intensity scale, it's extremely important. This image is from Phoenix, where we wrote a form-based code in 2013 on their light rail corridor. The building in the upper left was built using the form-based code. The surrounding conditions predate that code. From a building size perspective, the bottom of the image shows 2 vastly different buildings. One is single story on the left and the other is a tall tower. These have nothing to do with each other and they fail to create a cohesive place. the parking lot. It's a different issue, but form also addresses this issue in a unified development ordinance, which we'll talk about. In this instance, the street it's really designed for pedestrians and transit. The city pumped a whole bunch of money to rebuild the street, but they're really not recouping that money with those uses along the edges of it. The parking along that sidewalk is really incompatible with the investment in that street infrastructure. Now the new building, on the other hand, it's a moderate scale to match the intended future of the corridor. The corridor is intended to grow to that scale. It's designed to support the street and those people walking along sidewalks. So starting with form first, we can solve most of the compatibility issues. And after this, standards for uses and performance standards are layered on to further regulate development. This means that the uses can be greatly simplified as a building with the form, showed on the upper left, that new building. Buildings with that form could be mixed use. They could be purely residential. That could be an office building. It could be a hotel. The form is what makes things compatible. Now, of course, as we said, it's not new to Orange County to have form-based elements. There's some plan developments that have aspects of form-based codes, and the iDrive code that was adopted a few years ago is also a form-based code, and it uses the same terminology in terms of translate zones that we'll look at here in a few minutes. And there's plenty of others in Florida, including Miami, which adopted their code overhaul in 2010. And our firm was the primary author there. Here's an example of a new CVS on the right-hand side built in Miami to match the form of the existing buildings that surround it, as directed by the form-based code. It's not always about gigantic buildings. It's really about determining the character of the context and directing the sort of form of the outcomes to reflect that character. So here's a different type of example in Miami. In this case, the street to the left, it's targeted for some pretty intensive infill. I mean, that's a big building. And to address this condition, the form-based code requires a transition of form to retain compatibility with the adjacent housing on the right. It's still a much more intense adjacency than would be expected with Orange Code, but the transition considerations are much more easily built into a form-based code because you understand how form can assist in compatibility. So here's a view of that street on the other side. Maybe not the best thing in the world, but you can see the scale is matched. The very tall building at the far left, but the scale is reduced to the same size as houses across the street. The units on the left have entrances along the way, so they act very much like the houses across the street. And that's really critical to keep the street active. And these are sorts of issues that form-based codes can address because they're concerned with form before use and before other considerations. So quite a lot of development occurs on larger properties. And so this is where we get into the Unified Development Ordinance. So there's a lot of development that occurs, as you know, on large properties or a collection of properties, and those require new streets and new open space to be added. And compatibility with adjacent properties is an important consideration. Now, these sorts of requirements and considerations fall under subdivision regulations, and they're evaluated by reviewing development site plans. In many cases, and presently in Orange County, the zoning code and subdivision regulations are not well coordinated. This often occurs because they're located themselves within different documents entirely, or half in, half out, and they may be under the jurisdiction of different departments. So a Unified Development Ordinance solves this problem by combining both the zoning and subdivision with the same code, and that's how Orange Code is written. To demonstrate the connection, we'll look at a site that this has been presented before, but it demonstrates this pretty well. And this is a high-intensity example. It's not the type of development that would occur everywhere, yet it's very appropriate for this location. It's not abutting existing neighborhoods. It's located adjacent to major roads and highways. And in any case, this site is large enough that Orange Code would require that it be divided into multiple blocks and properties, and that open space be provided. So here's one potential way that streets could be located in order to create blocks. Orange Code sets a maximum dimension for blocks because small blocks are easier for people on foot rolling and biking to get around, and large blocks require cars. So this level of regulation occurs within the subdivision standards. Subdivision standards are also where the size, location, use, and type of open space is regulated. Open space that lines the outside of a property really is wasteful, while open space that is well-formed and integrated with the development can really enrich people's daily lives with recreation and interaction. Subdivision standards also regulate streets, pedestrian ways, and similar means of getting around. Streets are an extremely important element to get right if we want to make walkable and vibrant places. And finally, the buildings. And this is where zoning and subdivision meet each other. In a unified development ordinance, all of these stages are considered together and coordinated. Blocks are not complete without buildings, and buildings need blocks to be located within. And as you might imagine, the details of a street should change in relationship to the scale and the use of buildings along it. So Central Ave and Washington Street are really not interchangeable. If you put the buildings along Central Ave on Washington Street, it just wouldn't work. There are too many people, they would trample the grass, there would be too much traffic for the width of the roadway, and there wouldn't be enough sidewalk for groups of people to walk past each other, let alone the neighbors being really mad about that. A unified development ordinance, however, coordinates these elements. And next we'll look at the tool that Orange Code uses to coordinate buildings, infrastructure, and open space. And that's the transect. It's a wonky word, I know, but it's something that you'll just need to become familiar with. The transect really is the way that compatibility can be coordinated between different intensities of development and between private development, infrastructure, and public investments. The transect categorizes development according to intensity on a scale of 1 to 6, 6 being downtown and 1 being natural undeveloped places. Then there's everything in between. Don't worry, we'll get into this. But we call these transect zones, and they're the basis for Orange Code's new zones. We'll talk about this in detail in the next meeting. But from least developed to most developed, there's T1 for natural lands, T2 for rural and agricultural lands, T3 for suburban single-family areas principally, T4 for areas that are essentially on the edge of single-family neighborhoods and the edge of centers. They're really connectors, and those include a variety of different types of houses. T5 for centers like main streets or small downtown areas, like the scale of Winter Park, for example. And then T6 for really intensive areas like downtown Orlando. So this is the same system being used in Miami and Phoenix, as I've shown in other examples, but also in hundreds of other places across the country, as well as internationally. In a county like Orange County that has rural concerns, we've applied this in Doña County, New Mexico. The transect zones there are used to regulate development in the city, as well as many towns and suburbs, and the rural environment that has small hamlets and agricultural lands. However, I'm not suggesting that it would result in Miami or Phoenix or Las Cruces. Rather, it's the basis of categorizing compatibility, the details of which have been adjusted to match conditions in Orange County, as Marina brought up earlier. As a categorization system, though, the transect helps to coordinate the transition of scale and intensity from more intense places like downtowns to less intense places like neighborhoods and eventually the rural and natural areas. And it's a clear system to ensure compatibility of form. So generically, this is done by coordinating site, buildings, street, and park formats according to the overall intensity of activity. Now, density is just one aspect of this, which also includes whether there are a lot of different uses or very few uses, if building forms are large or small, and if there are many people walking, rolling, and biking, or really not very many. In more intense places, what we call transect zone 6 or T6, there are more people on sidewalks, so sidewalks need to be wider. And there are more businesses, so streets need on-street parking. And there are more activities going on within each building, so the buildings are larger. This is really akin to downtown, as I've said. Towards the opposite end in T2, which is the sort of rural and agricultural area, there are many fewer uses and essentially nobody walking to get to services and shops because things are very far away. And here there may be a shared bike and walking trail, but maybe it's separated from where the cars drive, since cars are traveling relatively fast in that area and that type of environment. and being a little bit further away as a cyclist or a pedestrian is safer and more comfortable. Here, buildings are lower in height and located much further from roads. And so all along the spectrum, from the rural areas to downtowns, the details of sites, buildings, streets, and open spaces change. To further address common reactions that a lot of people say, well, it's a generic system. We should look at how other places might be categorized this way. Across the US, as well as outside of the US, we can use the transect to describe the differences throughout cities and regions. The system also crosses cultural boundaries. All cities really have downtowns and neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods near the downtown tend to be more intensive than those neighborhoods that are further away from the downtown. I've certainly experienced this in Tokyo and Singapore as clearly as in Orlando downtown and Winter Park. The transect's been used in zoning in recent decades in order to coordinate all these details of growth. And that stands in opposition to today's zoning, which has no means of determining compatibility or coordinating between infrastructure and buildings. In fact, it's today's zoning that is generic. It's a system that began principally after World War II, and it's been replicated across the United States without regard for local history and regional variation in building techniques or climate. Every culture builds cities which vary in intensity from areas of high activity to areas of low activity. And the transect really captures this reality and allows us to align zoning with human traditions of cities, towns, and rural areas. Here was a comment on the streets. Here's what today's zoning produces. Should Orange County, Florida be the same as Orange County, California, and Houston and the suburbs of Detroit? We could easily do the same comparison for residential areas as well. Whether they're single family or multifamily, it's really kind of the same across the US. And today's zoning is generic and has made most places in the country look just like each other. Sure, some places require more expensive landscaping, but they're all really the same. And none of this works for people who are walking, rolling, biking, or using public transportation. It really only works for people driving. But back to the transect, let's really close by walking a little more slowly through the different transect zones. T1, this is reserved for natural areas. In most cases, these areas are preserves with no human presence, such as the many wetland systems in the county. However, there are other cases where T1 may be used for large county parklands, like Wekiwa Springs State Park, for example. T1 really is the most restrictive zone, with essentially no building permitted aside from park structures and buildings necessary for utilities. T2 is next to this. This is for rural areas that are principally in pastoral or agricultural use. Of course, this also includes homes on very, very large properties, but that's really what's common in the rural landscape. T2 has an interesting diversity of uses, and that's necessary for productive use of agricultural and pastoral lands. They're not just housing, they're actually working places, and those uses that are necessary to support that economy. Building here is generally low in scale. It occupies a minuscule amount of any property. And because the properties are so large, though, destinations are very far away. So walking and biking is typically recreational rather than for transportation. And as a result, roads are oriented more towards cars and trucks than towards people walking and cycling. T3 is for suburban, which are particularly, they're principally areas of single family housing. Here, buildings are generally low in scale and set relatively far back from the street. Sidewalks here should be present because there's people walking, but they don't need to be all that wide, since only a small portion of daily trips are taken by foot, usually for recreation. But the area between the sidewalk and the pavement of the street where the cars are, here it can be wider to allow for larger street trees to shade the streets and the sidewalks to reduce the heat radiated by the pavement, because there's a lot of pavement for area for each house. And because most trips are taken by the car, streets are slightly more balanced for the car than other users, but bicycle access is really increasingly important. There may be some on-street parking, but usually this is mostly used by visitors and younger family members, as most parking is managed by garages and in driveways. Into T4, this includes a mix of housing at different intensities, from smaller single-family homes to townhomes and small and medium-sized multifamily buildings. It may also include some small businesses like a salon or a law office. Because there are more people, sidewalks in T4 are wider and on-street parking is common. The space between the sidewalk and the streets where the cars are often includes a little bit more paving to allow people to access parked cars without trampling the grass and destroying it. Because there's more people and more bikes, the streets need to be slower, and the balance is about equal between the roadway users, pedestrians and cyclists and cars. And buildings here are a little bit taller than T3, and they're also closer to the sidewalk. And they take up more of their property than they do in T3. Now T5 is much like Winter Park's downtown. The scale isn't all that tall. It's not like downtown Orlando, but there's a wide variety of uses that are all mixed together, and that includes housing. Because there are so many people on the sidewalks and biking, the design of streets here has to be oriented more towards those users than the cars. On-street parking is an important part of the zone, and sidewalks are very wide, and really there typically isn't any grass along the side of them because it would be trampled or collect garbage. And business uses may occur within the buildings, but they also may spill out onto the sidewalk. And in these environments, buildings are located right up to the edge of the sidewalk, and they occupy most of their properties. And then finally, there's T6. These are the most intensive places like downtown Orlando. And I won't go into the details like the others because it's pretty clear, but I'll note that this zone is not necessarily intended to be widely used in the county. Rather, it's principally targeted to iDrive and a few other much more targeted intense areas. And iDrive already has a form-based code that uses a transect and T6. Now back to the roads thing, to further prove that the transect is being broadly adopted as a responsible zoning and planning tool, just look no further than Florida Department of Transportation. FDOT is rapidly changing their standards in order to promote safety for all roadway users. They've been called out for not being safe for pedestrians and cyclists. So they've really taken it to heart, and they're promoting safety for all users, freight users, drivers, walkers, rollers, bikers. And in order to coordinate the design of streets with the intensity of buildings and uses, they've also adopted the transect. Orange Code plugs directly into the system to ensure that state and county roads, as well as new local roads built by developers, are all aligned with the intensity of buildings and uses and the predominant mode that people use to get around. And in C6, which is the same as our T6, over here on the right, there's a whole wide variety of ways people get around, and there's less variety over on the left as we get to the lower transect zones. Here's a diagram we've used for many years to explain this. As buildings get larger and include more uses, sidewalks need to get wider, and the whole area needs to manage more people walking. It's really that simple. And I always find this to be one of the most accessible ways of conceptualizing how the transect coordinates multiple details of buildings, site design, and streets. You can think about street lighting like this as well. Fencing is very different if you're downtown, in a suburban neighborhood, or in a rural area. And zoning includes fencing standards. And it's not normally coordinating fencing by height and material. Now, coordinating fencing by height and material using the transect really solves for the issues that otherwise come into play when you don't have this connection to intensity. Here in T5 and T6, the more intense areas, fencing needs to be more solid, and it's usually taller. These are at the bottom right-hand corner of this image. In suburban areas, fencing should be fairly transparent and low when it's along the street, but it may be taller and more solid along the side and rear edges of property. And then in rural areas, fencing is really more functional than it is decorative. And lastly, I'll point out the easiest way to conceptualize the transect's role in ensuring compatibility. That is in conditions that are clearly miscoordinated, otherwise known as transect violations. So here's a perfect example in Orlando. The building on the right would be considered in a transect zone 6, T6, and the building on the left in T3. T6 should not be directly adjacent to T3. They're incompatible. And the transect clearly identifies the incompatibility of the situation. From a code perspective, we can clearly ensure that this is not allowed. And in order to pass something like this through a variance, the argument would have to be very, very compelling with significant community support for it, because the transect is all about compatibility. Of course, where you have the same zone, you have compatibility, whether the use is similar or not. While most of these buildings are mixed use, they could easily differ in use as long as their form remains similar. Well, that's what we're really going to get into in this meeting. I wanted to keep it high level so that we can dive into the details with a strong understanding in the next meetings. We'll take attendee questions in a moment and for the rest of the time that we have available. But please note again that there will be 2 more sets of Orange Code meetings to dive further into these details. And the last item before questions is a call to stay involved and get your neighbors and friends involved as well. As always, the Vision 2050 website is where you'll find more information on the comprehensive plan in Orange Code, meeting recordings and surveys, and finally to further questions.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to ask you one question because it relates. The first question I'm going to ask you relates specifically to the last 2 set of slides you showed on incompatible and compatible uses. And the question is, as it relates to unincorporated Orange County, as developers begin to plan and build, what changes can be expected in established neighborhoods? And there was a question about what kind of use and density, particularly use, is the use based on community need or the developer business desired area?
Well, those are two very different questions. You know, the first,
but they deal with compatibility. They both deal with compatibility.
Well, okay. Well, the first in terms of existing neighborhoods, and we're normally talking about existing single family areas. There's not much change anticipated through the code. I'd say the one difference between existing residential and our T3 zones, which is what would be mapped there, is that we do pay a little more close attention to how parking is managed in new development, so that parking is less impactful to, say, sidewalks and neighbors than it may have been previously. But otherwise, in terms of setbacks and building heights, all those details are intended to be similar to the current situation. The other question, Marina, I think that's really a difficult one, because we're talking about market conditions and so forth. Now, in part, what the code can do to address concerns is ensure that there is not a direct adjacency between very intensive new uses and very low intensity existing adjacent properties like single family. So to go directly from single family to like an 8-story mixed use building with a hotel, that's really the sort of compatibility issue that we're dealing with. In terms of which businesses may occupy those spaces, that is really a market issue more than it's an issue for a zoning code to deal with. There's a slight difference, however, in terms of what we call T4 and any business that might be in T4, which is much more restricted in size. But once you get into T5, and if you deal with any of the business of commercial leasing, it's a tough game, and a developer is not going to build space they can't lease, but they're not really, while you can attempt to attract good retailers, new retailers that are desirable for the neighborhood, it's a much more complex topic, and those users change over time. So, that part of the question is not as related to the sort of compatibility piece, Now, of course, there's still all the same use restrictions about, about adult businesses and all the liquor laws are the same and all that sort of stuff doesn't go away.
Yeah. Just to add a little bit to what you're saying, the use and density, particularly use, I think we've consolidated, and Matt will be speaking to this in much greater detail at the next series of meetings, but just to talk about use briefly and density briefly too, we arrive at density in the code in different ways, by controlling height, by controlling lot coverage, by controlling setbacks. So it's not as if density goes away and nothing can happen, but form is controlled in a different, more predictable, more easily understood manner, so that you all within your own neighborhood will quickly understand whether you have maybe only single family detached housings types within them, duplexes, the small triplexes maybe in single family, but that have separations between them, or is it appropriate to allow for townhouses in this neighborhood or beginning of attached townhouses? So we're going to be much more prescriptive about the type of buildings that are allowed, and that's related to use. But we also like to say that the size of the building impacts the uses that are allowed within them. So small scale buildings are only compatible with the types of uses that fit within the envelope of the small scale uses. Medium sized buildings will take slightly more additional uses. Maybe that's where you begin to introduce some commercial at a higher intensity. So Matt showed, for example, the little coffee shop that would be appropriate on the corner lot of a single family residential unit, versus I was recently in Kansas City and I was in this 3-story coffee shop, which was fantastic, where there was cafe on the ground floor, a roasting on the second floor, and sort of a restaurant on the third floor. So different uses can fit in different scale buildings, and it's very important to know where you allocate them. And so what the Transact does so well is allocate the intensity of the use to certain areas, whether it's a low intensity or high intensity. I guess we'll leave it at that for the uses and density, unless Alberto or Eliza or Greg or anybody else has a comment on it.
One more thing on there, which is that in T3, which is really what's applied to most existing neighborhood fabric, in T3 is not a place where we let anything go. Neither is T4. There's still a use restriction. It's just not the first thing that we're concerned about. In T3, you basically don't have any non-residential uses aside from home occupations that might be allowed, and dealing with COVID, we there's a lot of change that's happened there, and also with things like churches and schools that you don't restrict from being in that environment, but otherwise that is a strictly residential zone, and T4 is principally residential zone as well, and that's really the majority of what would almost everything that would touch existing neighborhoods.
Okay, thank you, Matt. The next question, I'm taking this a little bit out of order, but since we're speaking about what housing types and use types, I'm going to direct this question to Eliza. Because we hear this question everywhere we go, do the surveys show that families and people really want to live in these high density multi-unit dwellings? I don't know too many people that really want to live that way. Is the demand for this style of living really out there? This only seems feasible for young single people, maybe. So before Eliza answers that question, because I think she's going to speak to specific areas, I do want to say, we just had the Congress for the New Urbanism last week, and the one statistic that stays in my head, because it's so hard to believe, is that more than 60% of households in America are composed of one and two people households only. The traditional family only composes, I think, 28%. So it's not only young single people who want to live in high-rise buildings, but it's also the elderly or people who are downsizing, empty nesters. And I'm seeing it in my own neighborhood. Once the kids go off to college, they're heading downtown because they want to be where the action is too, so they can walk to restaurants, walk to bars, and all of that. So because household size is shrinking, the variety of different building types that are offered need to begin to match that. And there is a real mismatch between the housing types that are being offered and what people want. So there is a market need for multifamily housing, but if you listen to the presentation Matt gave about a month ago now, that really describe place types and sector types. Like I said, the Transect allocates. So the Transect will tell you where multifamily is applicable and where it's not. We're not looking to insert big multifamily buildings in single family neighborhoods, for example. But Eliza, do you want to add to that point?
Sure. To Marina's point, it's not that any of these solutions will work for everyone, but that different people are looking for different solutions. So if it only works for a certain group, then it should still be provided. We also know that there are many families that already live in multifamily housing, whether it's because that's where they want to live or it's because that's what they can afford. We want to make sure if that multifamily housing is built, that it meets standards that would, for instance, allow those families to have access to open space or to be able to walk to a nearby store. So as we're going through this process, it's not just about changing, or even primarily about changing the mix of housing, such as affecting how that housing is designed. Now, we also know that we have an affordable housing crisis within the Central Florida area, and there's multiple task forces around that. So multifamily housing is also a way of increasing the overall housing supply without, as we discussed earlier, encroaching onto rural areas or existing neighborhoods. I do just want to touch quickly on, there actually was a study, and this is a few years old now, where an academic compared Boston and Atlanta. Boston being more urban and having a much more diverse mix of housing types, and Atlanta being primarily suburban with a less diverse mix of housing types. And what he found was that more people in the Boston region were able to find their fit than people in the Atlanta region. So it's not that everyone could find their fit or that everyone could afford the thing that they most preferred, but that there was a better match of people getting within the region that had more diverse housing options.
Thanks, Eliza. The next question is going to piggyback on a specific area, and I'm going to address this to Alberto. 4 years ago, Winter Garden caused us pain and money because a property was combined residential and commercial, both antique. And what will come with these new codes? And I presume it was a potentially incompatible use, but I'm not sure. So maybe you can speak if you may remember this issue, Alberto.
Well, I'm not familiar exactly with the specific reference
Northern Orange
of
County,
controversial development within Winter Garden, which controls its own jurisdiction as its own form of government. But I am familiar with Winter Garden, and the only point of reference would be that if the Renaissance revival of the downtown area, Main Street, at the level of activity from local residents and others that appreciate the character of that Main Street, wouldn't be a reality today if the mix of uses in a horizontal and vertical form would not be allowed. So when we speak of place types of places that represent a town center or a neighborhood center, it is indicative of this type of mixes of environments and experiences as well. So I would love to learn a little bit more about the controversy of the particular case that they're talking about, to figure out whether that particular conversion of integration of uses happened within the town center or in the outskirts.
The Transect is intended to directly address prevent these incompatible uses from being next to each other where appropriate. So here's another question for you, Alberto. What happens with areas with special overlay standards or previously approved design standards? Do they go away since the new code is better? Thank you for assuming it's better. Or how will they be enforced?
Yeah, so that's a very, very interesting question. Where we have overlays in Orange County today, that took quite a bit of community involvement because of the desirability of a specific outcome in terms of the built environment for those areas that are governed by those development standards. Let me be specific about the distinction between the standards themselves and what could potentially be architectural design guidelines. The guidelines themselves, and it is the case of some of the overlays that we have in the county, one in particular begins to restrict the style of architecture with very specific roof treatments or facade treatments that begin to allude to what type of architecture should be the final outcome of that particular community. We want to be careful moving forward as we adopt Orange Code that we're not stepping into current House bills that have been adopted recently, where specific design standards are prohibited by local governments or jurisdictions in terms of code, where they dictate specific styles to residential homes at different scales. So we want to be careful, and we're following those recent bills very closely to figure out and to make sure that what we have today is not in conflict with those recent laws in the state of Florida. But just to be specific about responding to the question is that we hope that taking into consideration the desires, that the overall outcomes and the initial intent of those architectural standards for those overlays, I think the place types that are going to be dedicated as part of Vision 2050 and Orange Code to those communities will be very compatible to what was originally desired as an overlay. So hopefully they would go away, but in a way that it will continue to reverberate its infill in the future.
Thank you. I've got one more code question and then two comp plan questions. So I'll end on this code question because it's another good question. Will new lower intensity uses be allowed in a higher intensity transect zone? For instance, if a parcel is located in T5, can a developer build a T4 building as of right? Matt, do you want to answer that?
Yes.
That's
yes,
right.
Generally so. Yes, there were some pieces where, if you have a very, very large lot in T5, there are some considerations for having only one single family home on a giant T5 lot as not being acceptable. But that's rare. I mean, in terms of building to a T4 standard and a T5, that's allowed. Building to a T3 standard and a T4, that's allowed, and so forth.
It's rare that most property owners want to not necessarily maximize the development potential of their site, but really take advantage of trying to be contextual. So while it's permitted, we don't often see it, but sometimes we do. So the next two questions are related to traffic and transportation. And I do want to say that Matt addressed it in his previous presentation, but since we have 5 more minutes left, I'll give you both Matt and Alberto an opportunity to speak about this. What considerations related to traffic growth and flow are being considered for major corridors in the Pine Hills area, i.e. Pine Hills Road, West Colonial Drive, Silver Star Road? Roads are heavily traveled currently. What will it look like in the 2050 vision plan? Alberto, you may want to talk a little bit about that one since it's very place specific.
Sure. So,
and I'll let Matt on to the next.
Yeah. So when we and I would like to also give the opportunity to Mr. Renzo Nastasi, the transportation planning manager, who is with us as part of this panel today as well, to address some of what's in the works today for those specific areas. I'm just going to allude to, again, place types and how we're now considering corridors to be part of land uses in Vision 2050. When we talk about Pine Hills and Silver Star general intersection, there's been past exercises and studies and engagements with the community that generated vision plans for how that area should transform over time. We're taking all of those standalone vision plans and are integrating them into these places that are going to be regulated in order, and they will belong not only in the new comprehensive plan as the place types, but also how those particular place types bridge over to Orange Code in order to implement that vision. We are having a special area study in the near future here within the next several weeks, where we're going to be conducting an exercise about the existing conditions of those suburban corridors and how we see those evolving as we continue to grow in the next 30 years. But Renzo, do you want to add anything to those specific corridors? I think they also added Colonial Drive, Hiawassee, and others.
Sure, and thank you for the question. So in regards to Pine Hills Road, we actually have just recently completed a study. Originally, the concept there was to widen the road to 4 lanes. However, after spending a lot of time with the community, the 4-laning of Pine Hills Road was really dismissed. And what we're proceeding with is more of a pedestrian-friendly type of corridor. So we're going to keep the road as a 2-lane road, but adding a lot of pedestrian amenities with a multi-purpose path, landscaping, and consolidating some of the driveways along the roadway. So I think this really fits into the conversation that's been ongoing here. So Pine Hills Road, initially we were focusing on auto-centric solutions, but really now we're looking at more of a multimodal solution. So again, it's really much more pedestrian friendly, at least the plan is as we're moving forward. And also transit plays a very big role in the corridor. In regards to Sand Lake and State Road 50, of course, that road is a state road. And as Matt mentioned earlier, the Florida Department of Transportation has really adopted a lot of the complete streets policies. And over time, I would expect that corridor will transform. Clearly, that's going to take quite a while before that transformation takes place. And again, it's a matter of accommodating all modes of transportation. Again, sort of moving away from the auto-centric perspective and more towards a multimodal approach. So that would be my input on those issues.
Well, you bring up a really important point, which is that Florida DOT, in order to change the character of their roadways, looks to jurisdictions like the county to identify the future character of those roadways through comprehensive plan policy, like we talked about with sectors and place types, and through zoning that looks at the form of buildings, like we're looking at in Orange Code. So in order for the state to modify their roadways, they're looking for the community to have these sorts of standards in place so they have predictability about what the future of those roadways will be from a land use perspective so they can match it with transportation.
Thanks, Matt. And there's one more question I'm going to address to you, and I know while Eliza is answering another one by text. Where is it? Yes, here it is. How is density and preservation of existing community neighborhoods considered as it relates to increased traffic flow?
Well, the goal in the end, well, one with existing communities is not really significantly changing much of anything, except for, obviously improvements that you need in the comprehensive plan to roads, to walkability, to access to parks. What the goal is for existing places is also not to increase their traffic. There's not a direct correlation between density and traffic, and in a lot of cases it's actually the opposite, where lower in density can induce more traffic than higher density, depending upon how far you have to travel to get to different uses, to get to your job, to get to the supermarket. And so by looking at infill and major nodes on existing roadways and adding people there, that actually has the opportunity to remove traffic from the roadways that otherwise would have occurred. And in recent studies produced across the country, and even in the 90s, Florida DOT studied some aspects of this, and found that that places that had a mix of uses within close proximity generated less traffic than places that were a lower density, but had uses that were not near each other. And now those studies have been further expanded and have found when you add transit to the mix, you can reduce trips up to 80% of what would be expected. Now that's with a highly transit-rich environment, but if you're not making the transit connection, you can still reduce the anticipated traffic by 40 to 60% over sort of single-family development pattern. So it's actually the lower density actually causes more traffic, and that's really not typically understood because it seems unintuitive, but it's been proven out in a lot of studies.
Thank you. And this is perfect timing. It's 8 o'clock, and we want to thank everybody for sticking with us for these past 2 hours of Code Talk. We want to encourage you to tell your friends and neighbors about this. Matt will be repeating this presentation tomorrow. And please stay tuned. And
answering new questions tomorrow. So answering new questions.
Answering new questions as well. Yes. Thank you all. Thank you to everyone who attended on behalf of the county. It's too many to name. I miss Greg. I see Renzo, and I see others as well. I don't know if Commissioner Wilson has any, not to put you on the spot, but if you have any additional comments or thoughts you want to share. If not, we will.
I really appreciate. Oh, sorry. I just really appreciate it. I think this was such a great session, and I look forward to hearing more. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, then on that note, good night, everybody. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Alberto. Thanks, Eliza. Thanks, everyone. And see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, everybody.